So I thought I'd start by saying that at first I thought it was a little bit of a weird transition between climate change and grazing and ecological sites, but after listening to Justin, to me it seems like a perfect transition. To me, the next question would be, how do you properly predict on a yearly basis what you're going to see? What do you expect on the land that you're looking at? How do you plan predictively for changes on the landscape based on different types of disturbances, such as droughts or wet years? And to me, ecological sites are the logical solution, a tool that actually is going to give you a piece of paper that historically documents the changes on a piece of land that you can then talk to a landowner about what you understand about that system and what kinds of changes you expect to see during years of too much rain or not enough rain or any other kind of disturbance you might expect. So since I know that you guys already have sort of had some precursor presentations and the field trip yesterday talking about what an ecological site is and some of the basics, I'm going to kind of go into more of the ecological site process of how you build your concepts, the work you do to put into those concepts, and the process of refining that information and coming to the point where you have something that you feel good about that you can then write about and describe as a system. So hopefully I won't bore too many of you that have probably heard this talk before. I didn't have a ton of time to develop a whole new presentation, so this is it. So the ecological site concept is like a species concept. It's really tied to the idea that there's certain boundaries that formulate that concept on the ground. And it defines the distinguishing geophysical properties of a site and its state and transition model. And the ecological site and the state and transition model should always be developed together. So here, this came from a paper I helped write on kind of the thought process through the ecological development or ecological site development process. And it really mirrors the concept of the scientific method. You have a question, so you have your hypothesis of what you think is going on. You do background research to find out what information is already out there that relates to your question. That should be an exhaustive review, and then you do some field reconnaissance, look around the landscape, see if you're seeing that on the landscape, what other things you see on the landscape, and then you develop some initial site concepts. You say, okay, this is what I think is going on, I've seen these things, here are my boundaries, and then you go test them, just like you would anything else. When you have a question, you test it to see if it's right. If you start to find that the idea or your question, this information you've found supports it, then you move on, accept it, collect more data, and describe it. What if you find out that it doesn't really come together the way that you thought it did? Well, that's when you reject that question, figure out what those things are that are different, go back, redevelop those concepts, refine them, go out and test more data based on those refined questions or concepts, and do the process again. So that's something that kind of is just really a nice organized way to think about the process, and then reporting your results at the end is the ecological site description, how you're explaining it to everybody else, what you've decided makes that ecological site and the concepts. And there's data to support it. As I said, you go out and you test it, you collect data. So here you have a triangle to kind of illustrate the concept of starting out with numerous points to capture a lot of data and just see the variability across the landscape. As you test that and refine your concepts, you're going to go back to places that really are targeted towards being closer to what you think is going on, something that represents really what you're seeing. And then lastly, you're going to be up at the top collecting that really highly characterized data that truly defines exactly what you're trying to say. And these are like the typified sites. So we'll go through these in more detail as I go through, but this is the basic concept. So when you're doing your background research, there are things you should ask yourself. There's how should the ecological potential vary across the landscape? What do I expect to see? What does the research tell me I might see? You're going to refer to any kind of existing information that's out there, existing maps of soils, geology, weather and climate, vegetation, hydrology. Some of the same stuff that Justin was referring to today might be good to inform you of some of the issues in climate and how it's changing, which would inform you of some things you would potentially see when you're out there. Interviewing local knowledge experts, in my opinion, is a really important piece. They've seen a lot more of the country than you have. They've been working it a lot longer than you have. They're going to fill in a lot of gaps in what the literature can tell you and what your maps tell you. They fill in a lot of the extra holes of what really have you been seeing? Does it match these things that I've been reading? Historical documentation, survey records, journals, diaries, any of those kinds of things are going to give you good background history. The guy at the plenary session on Monday from the Native American, I can't remember what his specific title was, but he works for the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And they are doing a map of the history of landscapes in California, tying them back to native traditional uses and patterns. That kind of information is also something that can tell you about what you're seeing on the landscape now and how that land has been used historically. These are all pieces of the puzzle, and they tell you a lot about what you're seeing now, what was in the past, and what might be in the future. And then the scientific literature, obviously, and published studies in the area. Oops, I went backwards. So from that background research, it should result in rudimentary groupings of climate, elevation zones, parent materials, soil properties, and vegetation and wildlife communities, and should provide you some information on the common land uses and management concerns. Those are going to be obviously key for the management interpretations portion, but also telling you whether or not you're looking at alternative communities versus reference communities so that you can tease out what kinds of responses you're looking at on the landscape. And in order to do that, you have to do reconnaissance. You need to be able to see the entire area. You need to be looking at the landscape across the entire geographic extent of where you think that ecological concept you're building is going to be found. Correlations among soil properties and vegetation. You should be thinking about those things. If you already have the maps, it's a lot easier to do. If you don't have those, that's where you start. You're at concepts of, okay, who do I collaborate with to start looking at the landscape the way I need to get the information I need to start making these inferences and these concepts. Variability in plant community soil relationships. This is when you start tapping into the local knowledge, reference sites. When you're out in the landscape, where are you starting to see what you think typifies that reference condition? When will you go back to maybe use those areas to help support that high intensity characterization data you might need? And you're making those observations across your entire major land resource area, or if you have them, the LRUs within them. And they should be systematic, and they should be fast and low intensity. So really that could be you're driving along, you see something, you stop, you take a GPS point, a picture. That's all that you really need to do in some cases to get an idea of what you're looking at. And once you have a big group of that kind of information, it starts to come together as patterns and things that you're seeing. So after the research and reconnaissance, you're developing your initial site concepts. Those site concepts, as I said, represent a hypothesis that can be tested. And clearly specifying your climatic, topographic, and soil properties that distinguish the site from others. I'm getting over a cold. So then things you want to think about when related to climate that should play into the site concepts you're building. Go back to climate. So you're looking at precipitation amounts, precipitation timing, temperature, growing season, wind speeds, those kinds of things. But going back to what Justin was talking about, I think it's really important to pay attention to this right here, because this is what drives change in communities. It's not the averages generally, and that's mostly because we very rarely see averages. We see the extreme ends of those averages. And when they're at the really extreme is when we see plant response and other types of things start to happen. When you have a 30-year drought instead of the typical 5-year drought, you get a lot of mortality. Or you start getting lots of hard freezes in places that didn't get freezes for a long time. You start to see mortality, changes, things that open up the community. Those are drivers. When the timing of the precipitation comes, if you've always been a winter climate and you start getting things more in the summer, what's that going to do? How does that shift what you're seeing? Those are the kinds of questions you ask, and those are the kinds of things about the climate that you start building into your concept of what you want to tell people about how they understand that. Topographic properties, elevation, aspect, slope, landscape position, and whether it contributes or accepts resources. Those are really key to how a system responds, where they're located on the landscape, whether they're flat or steep. Those kinds of things really make a difference in how plants respond to disturbance and how the site uses its resources. Soil properties that really have a large influence in plant response, surface texture, the importance of water infiltration, retention, and soil erodibility. What is that potential of the water in the soil to influence plant response? That's a really important thing. What are those soil attributes that really influence plant response? And how do you communicate to a user what that means for them when it comes to how that site that they're working on is going to respond to their management and everything else? Some of the subsoil horizons that might have an impact in how water gets into the profile or doesn't. Depth to root restrictive horizons, water table or bedrock, and chemistry. Are there types of chemistry, soil nutrient availability in the soil that has an impact on how plants grow, where they grow, what kinds of species grow there? And then you're going to specify a range and characteristics that vary at different spatial scales. That's one of the important things about developing an ecological site concept, is understanding how to use scale in the information that you're using. You got climate that's utilized at a very large scale for a spot that you're looking at that's not quite as large as the scale of the climate that's being applied. How do you remedy those things, and how do you communicate that? That's part of the thought process when you're building your site concepts. And then, this is really wordy, but the existing vegetation should not really be a primary ecological site criterion, because it's easily manipulated and therefore highly variable. So you're really wanting to look for the abiotic characteristics, things that are more static, that you can depend on, that are pattern-like on a landscape. And the last piece of the puzzle is going to be that vegetation that those abiotic factors really respond to. So nonetheless, certain species can be used to assist in ecological site definition and identification because they do provide clues. They are indicators of things. They're indicators of abiotic responses. They're indicators of the way that plant is using the site and what is out there. So for example, you might see a Great Basin wild rye. That might tell you there's more water availability in the soil profile than in a place where you just have blue bunch wheatgrass. So it is an indicator of something, but it shouldn't be the thing that says, well, I have Great Basin wild rye here, I'm going to draw a circle around it. It needs to be the other way around. What are those abiotic factors that exist that brings me Great Basin wild rye? It's just a way of thinking about the process. So your site concept should really be developed using geophysical attributes that enable the identification of the site if the whole thing burned down and all you had was the soil to call what your ecological site is. That's the idea, because plants change all the time, people use them differently all the time. So you really need to make sure you understand what that concept is, not needing the vegetation in order to do that. So where changes in soils, aspect, topography, and moisture conditions are abrupt, those boundaries are going to be really distinct. There's a really good example in the foothills that you guys were at yesterday. A little bit further out, there's an area called the Clear Creek Management Area. And it's a distinct line in the ground where the geology changes. And you go from a blue oak woodland with annuals in the understory to very heavy serpentine soils, and it's drastically different. It's like someone drew a line in the ground and it changed. That's really easy. It's really nice to see on the landscape. That happens maybe 1% of the time. Everywhere else, it's really gradual. Things change on a very gradual scale, as we know. So those boundaries are going to be very gradual. And that's where building your concept starts to be very important. Where do you draw those boundaries, and where do you say this is where this site concept exists, and this is where we've changed to a different site concept? So here is just one example from an area when I first got to California that I worked in Pinnacles National Monument of 3 of the ecological sites that I wanted to draw out to help myself understand concepts I was building. And that's one of the tools to putting the concepts together that helps you kind of visually see what you're doing. You just draw little circles around it, put some categories to it, give you some soils information if you have it that gives you some idea of the differences. And here you can see this, they're both entic, but one is sandy skeletal and one is not. And then you have the bottoms, which are sands. So you have some different kinds of things going on, different plant responses, as you can see. This was mostly scrub oaks and manzanitas. This was chamise, and this was a lupin that grows in washes. So it was a nice, easy way to see on the landscape the patterns going on, and they're very different, and they respond very differently. So as you can see, there's a lot of relationships that go into an ecological site concept. They're multivariate constructs. There's a lot of things that interact together that collectively produce that similar environment for plant communities, similar ecological dynamics, and the similar response to disturbance. And here's a good way to kind of put out in a spreadsheet format some of the things that you're seeing. How do you start comparing your concepts between one another? And it's just a very simple graphic to show things that you could put together to start illustrating to yourself and cataloging what you're seeing on the landscape. And that's when you start going from the concepts that you have to this column over here, data collection needs. What do I need to do next? So you have some site concepts that you've identified. Now you're going to move into this category where you start targeting those sites that you've identified, and you're going to go collect some more intensive data to start really capturing what that variety is on the landscape within those groupings you've developed. How do we decide where to break ecological sites? It's the ability to produce the different kinds, amounts, and proportions in response to disturbance. So what are those things? Abiotic factors that influence plant production, composition, and ecological processes. Significant differences in the presence of species or species groups. Differences in the relative proportion of those species or species groups. Significant differences in annual production, or significant differences in responses to management actions or disturbance processes. That one, to me, is a more difficult one that takes a little bit of time to identify when you draw that line. What is a significant enough difference to the response of disturbance to make that break? Those things take time to refine and figure out. So there's systematic inventories of 2 types. There's the stratified random, that's based on your repeated samples of different ecological site delineations, especially those for which data are needed. And there are areas that you're deliberately selecting due to the information contained in them. So that would be your reference areas, specific degraded states that you want to make sure are captured. I think in a lot of cases, those end up being some of the more important ones in the West that really actually should have more data collected than even reference. How often are we working in reference anymore? But those kinds of things need to be highlighted and captured. And then areas with known management histories so that you can connect that management history with what you're seeing and start telling that story using the data that you collect. So that stratified random inventory, things that could be used to test your concepts include our GIS layers, DEM layers, used to estimate locations of the ecological sites and the random points that are selected within. You could, if you have permission to have Google Earth, use Google Earth or some of the other things that are out there technologically. Replication sufficient to build loose statistical models. We don't do ecological sites at the level of statistical validity, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking of getting enough data to make some kinds of inferences, which means you need to make sure you're repeating enough that you feel confident there's a pattern. So 1 point in 50,000 acres, probably not enough. So you have to start thinking about those things. Samples can be clustered, and samples can be stratified by the landscapes. Here's just an example of a data sheet linking observations of vegetation and soil using ocular estimates or quick line point intercept. It must be quick enough so that you can repeat it in a bunch of different places and start seeing the patterns or not seeing the patterns that you think you should be seeing. And so it needs to be something, even line point intercept, it could be step point intercept, where you're not even laying a tape out, you're just kind of getting some kind of repeating pattern. And there's databases. Some other agencies have good databases. We don't have a very consistent one internally that we use, so currently we are using some other people's databases. Some people develop their own, but until we get that good internal consistent database, it's still important to put it somewhere where you can query it and start looking at relationships. And it's a lot easier to do it in here in some kind of access database than it is on a spreadsheet. So finding some way to compare your data, look at the differences, search for things, it's very critical when you're collecting a lot of data and trying to refine your concepts to have that ability. Yes? Yes, it's the intention of it. Sorry. It will eventually get there to be a queryable way of looking at things, but because it just started, there's no data in there to look at. And there aren't a lot of reports or queries that have been built so that you can actually search that data yet. There's just places to put it. So it's getting there and it's building forward, but I would not say it's in a perfect place yet where we can do that yet. In some cases, every office is using their own database. So that is why NASA's took over a lot of the vegetation portion of it, because it is a consistent database that everyone can use, that has a structure in place already, a maintenance budget, all those things that all of these separate databases take. So that's why they went that direction, to support something more consistent and get us away from having 8 million databases holding various forms of data. So it's definitely an improvement from the ESIS database. So this is another way to graphically represent your data and start looking at the patterns that you're seeing. Along the one axis is cover of Laria, which is creosote for people that aren't from the desert. Percent calcium carbonate across this one and percent clay across this one. And that's when you start seeing some patterns and relationships that you could maybe say either support or may reject some of the things you've been seeing that you thought gravelly and gravelly loam were the same thing, but when you really see the response and the data, you could justify developing a whole different site concept for those more gravelly loams. So it's things like this that start helping you refine those concepts. And things like this that start to help you with your alternative states and potentially some of the building of your state and transition models, where you can see as Laria cover gets past about 12%, the perennial grass cover gets very low. So there's a relationship in this area being high grass and low creosote, and this area being low grass, high creosote. Now you have some numbers to go with it to say when it starts to reach a certain percentage, you might see a drop off. Those are things you can start making management calls on. So that's really important information. And then here's just an example of some of the historical evidence you could use to tie to your inventories and the story that you're trying to tell with your ecological site concepts. And the soil site correlation portion, just to illustrate that here you have two different kinds of soil components linked to the same ecological site, and here you have something different, and it's being called something different. So you're proposing a new site because you've found something that's enough different that it warrants looking at it differently with different soils. So some of the soil site rules to keep in mind are that an ecological site can include more than one soil series or soil component, provided that the soils are similar. A soil map unit can include more than one ecological site. Map units are composed of several components. Ecological sites are linked to components. So if you have a map unit that has 3 components, you could have 3 ecological sites, or you could have 1. That's how ecological sites are related, and that a soil series can include more than one ecological site. So that's an important thing to remember too. Soil series are broad. They cover a lot of variability in a soil series. So there might be something that the plant is keying into on one end or another of that soil series range that really matters for plants. It doesn't matter for soil taxonomy, but it matters for plants. So those are important things to keep in mind. And then lastly, you're up at the top. You've got a really good concept. You've used lots of data to refine and test it. And that's when you focus your data collection on those site locations you think most typify what describes that site. And you do much more intensive data. And it takes a long time to get here. So in some cases, in the reality of things, not every ecological site on this land is going to get to this stage unless it's important enough for management to spend the time. But it is important enough on the areas where you're doing a lot of land management to really get a grasp on what those numbers are and how to make calls management-wise on those types of ecological sites. It's important to also consider monitoring, because ecological sites really, when you think about it, are showing you spatial variation across the landscape. The information inside of it on production ranges over time, from the plant perspective, changes in composition over time, those are temporal, and you can only capture that if you've gotten enough data to see that change over time. So if you've had 5 years of drought and that's when the window that you collected data, you're not telling them anything except what it looks like in 5 years of drought. So it takes time to really get that long-term data that you need in order to properly give them that kind of temporal data. High-intensity data and other data that should be used to develop your interpretations, including domestic animal uses and forage, certain types of wildlife habitat by state or community that certain wildlife use, hydrologic functions, the recreation uses, and then other things that we are starting to see more often, the other ecosystem services that people are looking at the land to use, carbon sequestration, anything else you can think of. And that is what I have today.